Divorce lawyers of Reddit, what's the worst way you've seen someone fuck over their spouse? Not a lawyer, but one of the top posts from r/pro Avengers related. Credit to you /Tradia here. Not me, but a guy I worked with 10 years ago. I guess it counts as a revenge. I worked with a guy who really stuck it to his ex-wife. When I met him, he was working in a sporting goods store making $8 an hour. He was not really like the other retail monkeys. He was older, well-groomed, well-spoken, clearly educated, etc. One night after work he gets into his car, and I couldn't help but notice that it was a very nice newish Jaguar. I asked him how he could afford it, and he explained it to me. He had been an SVP at a well-known Fortune 50 company, which I will not mention the name of, pulling in $300k with bonuses and stock options. He was married, but the marriage fell apart, and in the divorce, she demanded that she get the house and 40% of his wages. He and his lawyer somehow managed to get her to agree to let him keep the house in exchange for 75% of his pay, no dollar figure or employer specified lol. As soon as she took the settlement he quit his job and looked for a minimum wage job. He said to me that she gets 75% of nearly nothing now. He had other money stashed away, so he didn't even need the job, and he had the house and its equity as well. Also, no kids, so there was no child support. Just alimony. She was furious of course, and tried to resue him, but failed at least once, and when she claimed that the settlement was not keeping her in the lifestyle she was accustomed to, he simply told the judge that the divorce was traumatic to him, and he could no longer do his old job as a result. At least at that time, she did not manage to get out of the deal. Not sure how it all ended, but I thought it was faking brilliant, if not crazy level spiteful. He was a good employee too, good with customers, showed up on time, no bullshit absenteeism or anything like that. He claimed he loved each payday because it reminded him how little she was getting. Not a lawyer, but when I was a kid my parents got divorced. My mom met a guy on the internet and left my dad for him. My sisters and I were all teenagers, and being that my mom had never really been around decided that we all wanted to live with him. We all had to write a letter stating our wishes, and it was understood that we would stay with him. My mom didn't even seem to care. Additionally, my dad had this retirement account from his old job. He wasn't rich at all, and had worked his ass off for everything he'd ever had. When he got hurt on the job he could have sued, but was promised that in exchange for him not suing, they'd keep him around. Instead they canned him, and he left with about $100k, I think, in a 401k type account that he'd been saving for nearly 30 years. Lastly, my dad had his house. It was a 3-bedroom, 1-bath brick house that was all of about 800 SF. It wasn't much at all, but my dad loved the place. My mom couldn't stand that house and wanted to move for as long as I could remember. That was another contentious subject that led to the divorce. He'd been paying on it forever, and when he left his old job, he took out a small chunk and paid it off. Anyway, their separation is progressing, and it's understood we are living with him. She was so in love with this internet guy that she didn't care. He was in school halfway around the country, and she was going to move there to be with him. We knew we'd get by just fine. They seemed amicable, and it was understood how this would all play out. The day in court finally comes, and instead of what we all assumed, even my dad's lawyer, she goes to the court with all these crazy claims. He was an abusive alcoholic, he beat us, and my mom nightly, he was crazy and no one would be safe in his care. My mom got full custody. She got 50% of his house and 50% of his retirement account. My dad was stunned that judgment would basically bankrupt him. In order for him to keep the house, he'd essentially have to clean out his retirement account and give her everything. The night of their divorce I went over to see him. He was almost catatonic. He just stared off in space the entire time and would mumble whenever I asked him a question. I've never seen anyone like that ever. My birthday was 2 days away, and I asked if he wanted to do something for my birthday and he just answered with "Your mom has full custody. I will if she allows me to see you." I asked if I could drive his old truck to school, since I didn't yet have a car, and he just said no, that I needed to call my mom and have her pick me up. So that's what I did. And the next day in school, the day before my birthday, I'm sitting in our lunchroom when I hear, "Hey, isn't that your grandpa?" from a buddy of mine. I look over and see my grandpa and a cop making their way across the lunchroom toward me. They told me to grab my stuff, and in the office I found my sister there as well. We rode home with them, where we were also met by my little sister, and that's where they told us that our dad had killed himself shortly after I left the previous night. To make matters worse, it all happened so quickly that nothing had been finalized. My mom dropped all her paperwork and legally became a widow and got everything: house, retirement, and his insurance policy. She also got social security benefits for us, a fact we didn't find out until much later. She basically took all the money and moved across the country with her new man, leaving us to care for ourselves for the most part. And to this day, when asked about raising us, she'll spin this story of a young widow doing her best to raise 3 kids on her own. My dad actually got faked by his divorce lawyer during my parents' divorce last year. My dad and my sister have never gotten along, and over the years it got more and more strained. They eventually got into a physical fight which led to a CPS report and him getting slapped with a child abuse record. They labeled it as confirmed but isolated, so he's not on the registry and you can only see it with certain background checks. In this case, my mom was obviously going to get full custody of my sister. My mom also wanted to give my dad the house, and his cars, and his money. Of a boat. Lawyer decided, because my dad is stubborn as fuck, that he would string old dad along. Lawyer spent hours with my dad trying to convince him that dad could get more money and custody from my mom. They did a divorce mediation, so they wouldn't have to go to court, and lawyer dragged it out for 4 hours. The whole time he was riling my dad up, thinking he could get things like the original down payment on the house, half custody of my sister, my mom's car, etc. At the end of the 4 hours of mediation, lawyer told my dad he should take the deal that my mom and her lawyer had originally offered in the first place, and dad signed that. So he paid about $12,000 in completely unnecessary legal fees. My stepdad has been divorced twice before. Both marriages had kids involved. First divorce was mutual and had shared custody of the kids. Second was because he was cheated on and also involved shared custody of kids. Wife #1 lived out of state and kept no showing, forcing costly legal action every time he wanted to see his kid. Wife #2 was initially supportive of him through this until they had kids themselves and the cost became too much. Wife #1 wanted him to give up legal rights to their kids, and after years and years of legal battles that nearly bankrupted them, wife #2 basically gave him an ultimatum: give up the kids or get divorced. He knew that getting divorced from wife #2 could result in him never seeing his other kids either, so eventually he was forced into giving up kid #1. A few years later, wife #2 cheats on him. They get divorced. Wife #2 tells the kids it was him that cheated, but to never mention it to him in case he gets angry. Initially they were splitting custody very evenly, but eventually wife #2 figured out that she would get more money if she was technically sole custodian, and he would see them on that basis, because he loves his children. So to arrange for this to happen, she accused him of molesting their youngest child, then used that accusation to gain full custody before the charge was dropped due to total lack of evidence. Then she tells the kids that he did molest them, again something he didn't know she told them for years. Upshot is that he was forced to give up first kids permanently by one wife, and then second wife had the rest of his kids think he was a cheater and sexual predator, and thus be terrified of him, and never truly love him, so she could save face and pick up a larger checkpoint like Tammy 1 and Tammy 2 on crack. Edit. Also, to be 100% clear, this story has details omitted or changed for the purpose of not identifying anyone. If this sounds like someone you know, then I fully empathize with them, but we probably aren't talking about that same person, which in itself is terribly sad, I think. Not a lawyer, but I met with a scummy one when I was looking to get a divorce. The first lawyer I met with, who had been recommended by a coworker as an amazing divorce attorney, suggested that if I wanted full custody, I should make sure people knew the relationship was abusive. Tell my friend/family, make sure the neighbors heard me screaming/begging him not to hit me, document every bruise, even if I wasn't sure it came from him. Thing is, my relationship wasn't abusive, and I'd already told her that multiple times. She never outright said I should fabricate evidence or anything, but she ignored my repeated statements that there was no abuse and kept on with her detailed instructions of how to document any abuse that might happen. I got the distinct impression that she was letting me know how to create an abusive relationship out of thin air in order to get custody of my kids. I ended up not using her as an attorney for obvious reasons, and in the end my ex and I shared 50/50 physical and legal custody of our children and raised them together despite whatever issues we had with each other. I can't help but wonder, though, how many dads lost a relationship with their kids because of her zealous coaching. Not a divorce lawyer, but I did surgical rotations with an obstetrician and have personally seen the lowest of the low in divorce hearings. People say a lot of shit when trying to place blame or get custody. A lot of it is straight up lies. Not all lies can be erased or taken back. The worst one is an accusation of sexual abuse. You cannot redact an accusation of sexual abuse against a minor point. It happened ridiculously more frequently than I can stomach. A spouse, trying to get the upper hand, makes the claim. Now the lawyer/court/state is bound by law to investigate. And suddenly that precious innocent child that mommy is trying to gain custody of is brought to the or sedated and then investigated inside and out for evidence of abuse. Those are about the only days that nobody in the entire wing says anything. No jokes, no smiles. Just a sick feeling in your stomach that takes away all appetite and joy. So many times, the parent who makes the accusation finds out what they are about to put the child through and tries to take it back. Tries to cancel the procedure. Tries to say they may have been confused or mistaken, or even admits they flat out lied. Doesn't matter. Once that box is opened, the investigation must continue. Of the couple dozen cases I saw, I can only recall one that supported the accusation. This lie put me and my little sister into foster care for a few years when we were young, but old enough to form memories. Corrupt judge put us there, even though there was no proof from the investigation. Side note, the memories I have from the investigation felt like sexual abuse itself. I did not want someone looking at me or asking me about my private parts. My mom taught me they were mine and nobody could touch them or look at them but me. But I couldn't refuse a court-ordered investigation and I didn't understand what was happening entirely. Finally my mom was granted a new judge after requesting one and our social worker quit her career just to testify for us to go home. I don't know where she is now or what she does, but she literally destroyed everything she worked for us. I would like to thank her one day, but I don't know her name. Maybe my mom does. We were home within a few months of getting a new judge. My mother was in her mid-20s dealing with this. She is the epitome of strength. She raised 3 kids by herself while continuing to be the first to help everyone around her. She's basically rehabilitated multiple teens too, so add 2 more teens there for a short period of time. They are both doing wonderful in life now from being on drugs and no plans for the future. Obligatory, not a lawyer, but my parents are currently going through a divorce. Luckily kids are all in late 20s/30s, so no custody battle, but basically my mum is a nutter and is desperately trying to screw my dad over as much as humanly possible. She told her lawyer that he has so many hidden assets, when in fact he has none. She lied and told the mediator that he has a record collection worth hundreds of thousands, when in fact it's probably worth like £8. She said his guitar collection was worth tens of thousands, whereas second-hand value, like maybe pounds to K. She wants all of his business's assets. All of them. She wants both houses. Her lawyer repeatedly reminds her that at most she'd get half of everything, but she clearly doesn't listen. Then she demanded back all of the kids, Christmas, and birthday presents from our childhood, like the violin they bought me when I was 13. It's hers. Obviously. /s. Her lawyer laughed at her and reminded her that's not how divorce works. They are still in the very early mediation process, so it'll be interesting to see how shit goes once they actually get started properly. Interestingly, despite her hollering that it's all my dad's fault, she was the one that walked out and subsequently shacked up with my dad's brother, whose wife had died 3 weeks earlier. Yeah, and that's why I'm completely no contact with my dickhead of a mother. My mother did something similar. I think you might have been confused on the scam your mom was trying to run. When the court is looking at assets and splitting them, they will take into account the current assets and each party can argue for why they should get some things over others. A big part of that is who the property was originally bought for. In my parents' case, my mother listed all of the assets she could think of and overvalued them. 10-year-old stereo system. The value was listed as the price it was originally purchased for. One thing she did was value the antiques they owned as far over what they were actually worth. I only found that out because I had the antiques appraised for my father, and I coincidentally went to the same appraiser my mother had gone to. Anyways, what you try and do is create as much on paper value for the property as you can, and then argue that you shouldn't get any of the property or should only get the liquid property. This creates a huge imbalance because one person takes on property that is extremely overvalued and not liquid, but on paper it will look like a 50% split. For example, husband bets $100k in assets, antiques, etc. actually worth $25k. Wife gets $100k in cash. How this is allowed to happen, I don't know, but it does. The judge in my parents' case went further. There was real estate that needed to be divided up. The judge gave my father one piece of real estate on which the market value was much less than the one he gave my mom. The judge justified it by saying that he used potential market value in the future to make it equitable. That is, my mom got the property worth $1 mil today, and my dad got one worth $500k, and the judge called it fair because according to him the $500k property could be worth $1 mil in the future. My dad appealed that all the way to the Supreme Court, and it was overturned. You can't just make up a future value, you have to use current market value. What's even crazier is that judge can impute income on people to support the alimony they are ordered to pay. Presumably this is to prevent people from stopping working to get out of paying alimony. The problem is that it can be abused easily by bad judges. My dad made the vast majority of his money from a lawsuit his company was involved in. It was a single, one-time multi-million-dollar distribution he received. The judge used all of the money he made plus what he made in that lawsuit to determine what his income was for the purposes of alimony. My dad was making about $100k a year from his salary and distribution from investments. The judge imputed $400k a year income for the purposes of alimony, which meant my dad was paying literally every dollar he made to my mom in alimony. You are only allowed to dispute that number after a year, and only once a year. After the original judge's order was overturned by the Supreme Court, my dad got a much more reasonable judge who was actually going to try and make an equitable decision. My mother saw the writing on the wall, and together with my dad we offered her a bunch of money as a settlement, because she had already sat 5 years of our lives litigating the divorce and putting our dad through hell. She took the settlement and my dad is now free of any obligations to her. Edit. I forgot to mention that the judge also gave my dad all of the debt and my mother none of it. Debt that he took on while they were married to start the company that eventually allowed him to make all of the money to buy all of the stuff my mom ended up getting in the settlement. There are a myriad of ways judges can screw people while keeping it equitable on paper. Not a lawyer, but my two bosses were married and opened a bike shop together. He was the brains and the backbone, since he was a former Olympic mechanic. She just sort of balanced the checkbook and worked a couple days a week. Unfortunately, he had no credit and she did, so when they opened everything was in her name. All he wanted in the divorce was the bike shop, and was willing to buy her half. She wanted the bike shop too, but didn't want to buy him out for his half. Mind you, her father passed away, and she was sitting on like $300k in the bank, and also had the audacity to take out student loans for her daughter to go to college. He lost the bike shop and I think he got a little bit of money for his share. What she didn't expect was that all of the high-paying customers would stop going there. They were all his friends or they only wanted him to work on their bikes, so I don't know why she would have had that notion. So he opened up his own bike shop and all of the regulars have become regulars at the new bike shop. Edit. I've been seeing a lot of comments asking how he gained the credit to open a new shop. Ever since he moved out of the house he shared with his ex-wife, he started putting money away and got a credit card. So over the course of a year, some months he built credit and was able to open a shop on his own. People have tried to buy into the business as an investment, but he doesn't want anyone else involved, since that screwed him over the first time. Edit 2. I appreciate everyone's upvotes. If anyone is ever having any bike related issues, head on over to r/bickerwrench. I spend a lot of time there diagnosing and offering fixes for people's bikes. I don't work in a bike shop anymore. I just work on my friends' bikes for fun and dabble in some frame building for myself. But remember to support your local bike shop. Don't buy bikes from department stores because they are typically dangerous as they aren't built by actual bike mechanics. Not a lawyer but got divorced. During divorce proceedings, when we didn't live together anymore, my wife filed a frivolous police report saying that I threatened her. In the police report, she wrote my apartment's address as her place of residence. A court immediately issued a restraining order against me, prohibiting me from being in my apartment that I rented while the restraining order was active. Several months, I had to live in hotels and Airbnbs, which of course is 2x 3x of normal rent, without having access to my clothes and other stuff. I also was paying the rent for the apartment that was empty all that time. She never actually went there during that restraining order, even though she claimed it as her residence. The restraining order was lifted as the case was dismissed after she never provided any evidence or even testimony. To that point, I didn't sign lease extension in time during this process because I had no information how long the restraining order will be for, even though it was lifted right before my lease expired. I ended up having to move and pay a broker fee. Of course, this also delayed divorce proceedings because we couldn't communicate while the restraining order was active. Besides that, she refused to sign tax form for married filing jointly. I ended up filing as married filing separately, which meant quite a few $1,000s extra in payment to I's. This was the biggest case of fuck you over without any gain for me that I have seen. My mom was a real piece of work in this department. My mother is mentally unstable and was very abusive to me as a child. When my father finally moved out and asked for a divorce, I was luckily old enough, 13, to legally decide who I wanted to live with. I, of course, chose my dad, and that enraged my mother. By court order, she was allowed to live in our 4-bedroom house while me and my dad had to move in with my aunt into a 2-bedroom house. We lived there for 4 years, while my mom did everything she could to slow down the divorce proceedings. During this period, my father was court ordered to pay the mortgage and utilities on the house my mother was living in. She would leave all the lights on and crank the heat with the windows open, just to drive the utility bills up. She once left the garden hose on for a week into a drain to even make the water bill outrageous. When it was finally all over, and she had taken my dad for as much as she could, she decided to sue him for my college fund. I called her and told her if she went through with it, I would never speak to her again. She told me if I wanted it, I needed to move in with her before I turned 18 so she could get child support from my dad. I refused. She won the case for the money, and my dad had to use most of what was left of the fund to pay for her lawyer's costs. Not a lawyer. Ex-brother-in-law got a girlfriend pregnant, had a falling out halfway into her pregnancy. So as a result, she moved across the country, fought him from the state she lived in, giving him no chance to mount any decent custody arguments without spending thousands in fees to travel. As a result, she ends up with full custody and getting the maximum amount for child support. He has paid said support monthly via direct deposit from day one and has never missed a single payment. For the first 5 years of his daughter's life, his baby's mama would file yearly with the state she lived in that he hadn't paid up to a maximum claim of 3 months no payment and was in hardship because of. The state she was in would cut her a check, bill it to our state, who'd garnish his wages under threat of jailing him. Each time she did that, it took him 6 months to rectify and get his garnished wages reimbursed. But there was no provision for our state to get money back from hers, so she never so much as got a slap on the wrist for doing this. finally record keeping in her state court up to the point that his bank could easily verify to said state that she had indeed been paid, which finally put a stop to her hardship claims. Edited to add context. I don't know why she was able to get away with it. A fake. Our state never considered themselves being defrauded because she never filed anything here. The child is now 12, so all this was prior to 2010. A fake. They will go back for a custodial hearing in the next year for her to have a choice in who she lives with. I divorced amicably from his sister 5 years ago. No kids, no BS, just people change, and we grew apart. Obligatory, not a divorce lawyer, but here you go. My parents got divorced about 9 years ago. I was 9. After the economy got facky, my dad, who owned his own business, could no longer afford my mom's extravagant shopping bills. Instead of having a talk like a normal person, he decided to stop paying the mortgage. The house was foreclosed upon years later without my mother's knowledge. Her credit was destroyed because her name was on the lease. It was about this time that my dad removed all the money from their shared bank account, leaving $135. He said, that should be enough for the two of you for a couple months. My mom sold her wedding ring at a pawn shop so we could have Christmas and I wouldn't know anything was wrong. My parents got divorced. My dad took her to court for everything, but in the end it ended up being a pretty fair divorce agreement. We were allowed to live in the house for 2 years before we had to leave. My mom overstayed that by about a year in an attempt to get me to finish middle school. That was when my dad broke into the house, stole stuff from us, changed the locks on the doors, and shut us out. We spent most of the night in the police station before they kicked my dad back out of the house, and we walked in to find most of our things missing. We went back to court and the judge told us we had until August 30th to move out, about a month. On the 20th, while I was sitting home alone, my mom was at work, my dad broke into the house and I hid under the bed as he ransacked the place. He found things that were rightfully ours that we were planning to sell to afford a new place and took them. So, yeah, not great. A bit of a different perspective here, from someone viewing the whole mess as a relative. The husband was severely faked over by the wife purely because she could. She divorced him in a no-fault state, providing her with immediate out-of-pocket support from him until the end of the divorce, as well as all bills paid. Now this doesn't sound so bad if the wife wasn't an abusive, vindictive bipolar monster. He's a gentleman, you know, the good husband type. But she just kept at it, arguing with family, abusing children, attempting suicide by sleeping pills, the works. The woman was an absolute train wreck. And due to the laws of the state, despite firing 4 attorneys and telling all of them, oh, just send the attorney costs to my husband, have him pay, the court just shrugged their shoulders and the divorce carried on for nearly 4 years because the state did not require a settlement be made. So she just kept declining all of his offers while continuing to bask in free income. It even got to the point where he was offering $500,000 over the next 4 years and she said, go fuck yourself. Over those 4 years his appearance and personality was like that of a president serving a term. It was absolutely awful to see. Edit. Consolation. Kids are all adults and mostly unaffected by the divorce. Heartbreaker. Divorce started after 27 years of marriage. So no, it wasn't a new liwat thing. Life's not always peachy after the first half decade. If it makes it any better though, the woman is mentally psychotic, unrelated to the bipolar, so this wasn't a standard falling out of love thing. Friend of mine cheated on her husband while he was away at school, military. She unfortunately decided to tell me about it. 2 days later I got this frantic phone call at 0530 saying that she and her kid needed a place to stay the night because her husband had caught her having an early morning phone conversation with a fuck buddy. Within 12 hours she had a court-issued restraining order claiming that he had beaten on her a few times. Except that I was friends with her husband as well. He most peacefully non-violent person I've ever met and is actually quite a pushover, so now this guy's being escorted from his house by police. Isn't allowed within 50 feet of the house or her or his own kid. Cops gave him 10 minutes to pack a bag and get out. For the next 3 months, he's living out of this bag, moving from house to house, crashing with friends. Meanwhile, his house that he's not allowed anywhere near isn't even occupied because his wife and kid are living with her fuck buddy. Eventually he gets himself together and starts taking her to court for custody and divorce. Everything slowly starts coming to light. When things start going south for her, she cries rap. The judge calls out her BS, but the military doesn't, and they open up a full-blown investigation. The guy is a CID agent. He investigates raps for a living. But with her accusation, he loses his badge and his gun, and gets pulled from every case he was on. Becomes a glorified dog greeter. The investigation takes so long that his re-enlistment window closes and he's forced to get out. After 10 years of service, he actually managed to get full custody of his kid and the rap charges were dropped. But all he's ever wanted to be is a cop, and now as a civilian he's having difficult getting a job because all they see is that he was charged at one point in time. He's had to sell his motorcycle and refinance his truck just to make ends meet. Also not a divorce lawyer. Happened with my parents' backstory. My father was married once before, but after suffering a brain aneurysm him and his wife calmly decided to split. In fact, when he woke up after his surgery he didn't even know who she was, and the recuperation was just too stressful on their marriage. A little, while later a sheetbag med student and drug addict who used her charms, passive aggressiveness and generally as hardly by charismatic personality to manipulate people into doing what she wanted for years, also known as my mother, met up with him. They're married for a pretty long time. They've both been married and divorced, and she still has 2 kids living with her who kind of resent my dad because he wasn't their actual dad. Yada yada yada. I get that point, but after those 2 move out and they have 2 new kids, their marriage gets strained. My mother isn't an addict anymore, but she is still a massive pile of shit. They get divorced, and for I think 8 years, maybe shorter, maybe longer, they both duke it in court, my mother constantly trying to fuck him over as much as possible. She never got custody. Me and my brother went back and forth, staying a week at one house then a week at the other. My father was left with no money, and since no one would hire him, because of the aphasia he was left with after the aneurysm, no job. Up until the divorce, my mother, being a doctor, made the money, while my dad looked after me and my brother. So he was royally screwed. Just last week, a long time after the divorce ended, I helped him move out of his house, which I grew up in, so he could go and live in his mother's, my grandma's, house. Luckily she isn't there most of the time, since she generally stays in New Jersey through the spring and summer, but it's still humiliating and depressing that on top of still being unemployed he now has to live with his mother to avoid going homeless.